Welcome to A Real Affliction, BPD, Culture, and Stigma, a podcast that explores how we live with, treat, advocate for, write about, and conceptualize borderline personality disorder. My name is Cynthia Gralla. Today I'm talking with Sara, the producer and host of Bold, Beautiful Borderline. If you're listening to this BPD podcast, there's a strong chance you already know who Sara is. Her podcast has been declared, I should say, the #1 BPD podcast for a bunch of years running, and it is well deserved. She brings so much life experience, humor, and hard work to her podcast, and people have told her that it has saved their lives, and I can well imagine it. I also really admire how she has been tackling political subjects lately and talking about the effect that the changes in the United States are having on people with BPD and other mental health disorders. In our talk, we mostly focus on her concerns about becoming a mother. This is a topic that I have been really interested in approaching. There are so many myths about people with BPD. We can't love, that's utter BS. Or we can't hold down a job or a career. That's also untrue. And I can prove both of those things with my personal experience, but I am childless, so I couldn't really talk about the decision to have children with BPD. Sara, in our discussion, is frank about concerns she has as she weighs the choice to be a mother. But I thought it would be a really good thing to focus on, and I really respect her openness in talking about this very personal subject. So I'm so grateful that she had a conversation with me, and I'm grateful to all of you for listening. So without further ado, here is Sara from Bold, Beautiful Borderline. And she is all of those things. So Sara, thank you so much for talking with me today. Of course, Sara is the host and producer, and I imagine pretty much everything of Bold, Beautiful Borderline. I think your podcast is very deservedly the #1 BPD podcast. How many years in a row has that been the case? I think it's been a few at least.
Yeah, I have no idea. I have no idea. It's been a few. The podcast started in December of 2020, so we've been rocking and rolling for a while now.
Yeah, definitely. And you put out a lot of episodes. It is kind of staggering, just so much. Does that ever get to be a pressure, or is it mostly a positive experience? Because I'm in awe of your productivity.
Sometimes it kind of like goes in waves. Sometimes it feels like this is all I want to do, and I'm in that hyper fixation, hyper focus, like borderline world because it's heavy on my heart. And then there's other
Yeah.
times where it's like, oh my gosh, this is so much work. It's hard to sustain. But I was literally just before I got on this call with you, I was recording an episode. And the end of the episode, the person told me, like, this podcast has saved my life. And
Mhm.
anytime I'm feeling really alone, I just pop it in my ears and listen. And so, having people tell me things like that is really like the reason that I keep going when it's hard.
Yeah, makes sense. And I think that the fact that you put out episodes frequently will help people in that way because it's something they can count on. And like this person said, it makes them feel less lonely, more connected. I think you say in the very first episode, I believe, you talk a little about the different diagnoses you've had, and those might have changed a little bit since then. The diagnoses, as we know, they often do change over time. We might drop some, add some others, but at least in that episode, you and I pretty much shared everything. I think you said BPD, and anxiety, depression, OCD, eating disorders. So those, all of which I'm familiar with. And you also said that you started this podcast in part because you didn't want to feel shame anymore. And you've done some remarkable episodes about shame. I know you've talked about it fairly recently too. I'm wondering how has the podcast helped you with shame, if it has?
I think that it's been the biggest change in my life. I still feel a profound amount of shame about the symptoms that I experience, but the
Right.
ability to say I have borderline is
Mhm.
something that I never had before doing the podcast. And the podcast was this way of just being like, nobody knows me, but I'm putting this out in the world as if it's no longer mine anymore, as if it can kind of exist in the world. Like the idea of
Right.
having borderline personality disorder is now out there. And I hadn't really met other people with BPD that I knew had BPD. And then all of a sudden, here's flooding in now hundreds over the years of people
Yeah.
saying I have borderline too. And the community has helped me be able to own that diagnosis in a way that I never had been previously.
I feel similarly about just having a podcast about it. I've also written about it. And it's kind of funny. I don't know if you had the experience that the first time I did start talking about it in public, it's sort of like when you have a dream where you're walking naked in a crowd or so. It kind of felt like that. But then over time, it's sort of, it gets more natural. Like you said too, like there are things I regret or feel some shame about having done due to symptoms, but the diagnosis itself doesn't have that hold over me, that terror, that dread, and that shame. And I think you've helped a lot of people with that. Another thing that you've talked about a lot, or at least, you've been really open about it. You're pretty much open about everything. And
Ah!
it seems like, you're so radically genuine. There's so much humor on your podcast. I think the first one I listened to, you were talking about endometriosis, which I also have, and just being really frank about everything from period poops. It was really refreshing, but sometimes it's really moving as well. And one of the really moving components is your openness about kind of your journey with reproductive choices. And, I think this is such an important topic for people who struggle, not just with BPD, but with various physical and mental health conditions. I myself have BPD and endometriosis and also systemic lupus. And all of those things kind of condition my decision not to have children. But I think you're leaning more. I know you've said you really want to be a mother, and I'm just wondering where you are in that and kind of just how BPD has impacted those decisions.
Yeah, gosh, it's impacted it so much. And I also want to clarify, my previous co-host of the podcast has endo. I don't have endo.
Right.
I don't want to take on that the severity of that identity. I haven't
Hmm.
experienced that. And I know that like endo and other reproductive like health issues rather than, I'm experiencing the choices around that, but those health issues can take away choices and that's so devastating.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
But yeah, borderline and my choice to parent. I mean, I can't even talk about it without talking about my family of origin, right? So I
Hmm.
come from such a unique family system. I was raised primarily with my mom's family. My father's family is in Canada, and there is a lot of like addiction and mental health and struggles on that side that I think my parents chose to be closer to my mother's family, which is so ironic because there's a lot of addiction and mental health issues on that side too. But my mom was one of seven, and we were really close with all of the cousins and grandparents and all of those things growing up. But my mom was one of seven, and three of her brothers have died by suicide.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
Yeah, and so that's been a really unique part of my lived experience because I was 12 at the first suicide, 18, and then 24.
Wow.
And I sort of observed over time this big, beautiful family system that I thought that I wanted and would participate in sort of implode
Yeah.
as these deaths occurred. And I had built this idea as a child that I would have that family system, that I would participate and recreate that for the future generations, right?
Hmm.
And I'm not close with any family members like from my extended family anymore because those deaths really took a toll emotionally on the relationships between
I'm
the
sure.
families. And so it's been really hard to contend with that. It wasn't just the deaths of these people, but the deaths of an idea of what a family would look like. And so I'm one of two. My brother is gay. He doesn't want to have any children. If I have children,
Right.
they won't have any cousins, That's its own thing. separate from the fact
Mhm.
that I do want to mother, but how do I mother in a way that my children aren't impacted by addiction? That requires me to stay sober, and sobriety is.
Right.
And how do I mother in a way where my children aren't subjected to these generations of trauma? That requires
Yeah.
me to be really stable. That requires me to navigate my suicidal ideation and these things. It's really challenging to think about because the way that I would want to mother and create an environment for a child sometimes feels out of reach.
Yeah. And intergenerational trauma is so hard to get out from under. I can definitely empathize with that. Was there an awareness when you were younger in this big family that there were maybe some mental health issues? The people who you lost in your family, were there people who were they people who had been struggling with mental health issues that were diagnosed or being treated?
Oh gosh, I think everyone was struggling with
Yeah.
health issues and addiction, some pretty profound alcohol and opioid use. Treated? No. I think my mom came from a very poor, split households, lack of education, right? My grandmother has a fifth grade education, and somehow she became this multi-property owning lady. She made Danner boots. I mean, you're from the States. I don't know if you're familiar with Danner boots, but my grandmother like worked in a warehouse and made boots for her career.
I'll have to look them up. I don't know them offhand, but yeah,
Yeah.
I am originally from the US, originally from the East Coast, Boston, but in Florida. But I lived in the Bay Area for 12 years for grad school, so kind of
Mm.
moved West Coast. But
I love the Bay.
yeah, I miss it. Wow. So they really kind of rose up out of poverty and built something. I don't know if it's just where you come from socioeconomically. There's definitely a generational shift in that people, I mean, I'm Gen X, and I feel like we were the first generation where people really were getting treated and talking about it a little bit. And then with millennials, it just kind of exploded. Same thing in my family. There were very explicit signs of all kinds
Mhm.
of mental health issues, but people didn't talk about it. And I was the first one to get help. And sometimes it felt like people thought, well, then she's the only one who has the problem. Whereas, like, as you get to know yourself more through therapy and you realize, no, this is all part of this ecosystem. When did you start getting treatment and help with BPD?
I started going to therapy when I was 17. My symptoms presented really young. I remember having
Hmm.
suicidal ideation when I was like 8, 9, 10 years old.
Yeah. Yeah.
I like wrote I want to die, on like
Hmm.
paper in my room and whatever when I was a
Yeah.
kid. But treatment, I started going to therapy for, depression, anxiety when I was about 17. And when I was younger, I have ADHD. I didn't get diagnosed until I was 28, but when I was younger, I had this like obsessive counting behavior. And
Hmm. I did too. Yeah.
I count, even to this day, I count all of the lines and letters and make them add up to 20. It's this very weird. So my mom knew that there was things happening with me, but
Right.
in terms of getting treatment, yeah, my doctor like tacked on an OCD diagnosis when I was a kid because of the counting and the spelling and stuff. But therapy, 17, I had an inpatient, very short inpatient stay at 18 for depression and suicidal ideation and planning. And then, group therapy and those things over the years. But I had probably 6 years of consistent therapy before I saw a psychiatrist who said, this is borderline. I was 23 at the time and I was in my graduate program for social work. So I was
Mhm.
familiar with borderline, but I was familiar with it from the lens of like, those are the patients we don't want to treat because they are very hard.
Right, because you had been studying social work. So that's so interesting. You already had that, you'd seen the stigma that's kind of perpetuated by education, where it does seem like a lot of it originates, unfortunately. So was that when you heard it, did that make it even like scarier as a diagnosis? Were you afraid that it would be hard to get help, even though I guess you were already getting help?
I think because I had a therapist that I was working with that it wasn't the right type of therapy looking back, but at the time I had
Right.
a good therapeutic relationship. I
Yeah.
wasn't afraid, and my therapist at the time didn't agree with the diagnosis, but as soon as that psychiatrist said borderline, I started
Mhm.
crying and I knew that that was right. I knew that depression and anxiety were an appropriate diagnosis for me, but there was something else that wasn't being
Right.
captured.
Completely relate to the counting and the numbers. My number is eight. If I look for sentences that have eight words in them, and
Hmm.
sometimes I do wonder, I don't know why. It's just always been like that. I wonder how that's entwined with my becoming a writer and literature scholar. It's just, it's always nice to find someone who kind of understands that, although it can be really debilitating at times, for sure. I think for me, it was worse when I was younger.
Yeah. Yeah, I learned how to like trick things into being 20. Like I like
Mhm.
created different alphabets in my head with different lines so that they all could add up to 20 in some weird way. But yeah, it was
Which is
really
amazing and
distressing.
creative, and it's so highly verbal and, doing amazing things with language.
Yeah. Yeah. What kind of writing do you do? I mean, I know we're going to talk about it on my podcast, but just for my own self right now.
Yeah, well, I've published two books. One was a novel with commercial publisher in the U.S. and also a book based on my dissertation. But the past like 5 or 6 years, I've been publishing a lot of essays and short stories in literary magazines. I actually, full disclosure for the topic we're on, I have an essay coming out in the Best Canadian Essays 2026 anthology later at the end of this year, and it's about my decision to be childless, but also all the conflict I feel about that decision and how I still feel like I'm part of this broader ecosystem at the same time that I can feel alienated as a childless woman. So I have been writing a lot about mental health. I'll write essays about things like BPD, but in a literary way, and I'll also bring in a lot of comparisons with literature and things like that.
I mean,
Yeah, so it's interesting that we both have that love of words.
yeah, my mom's well, my mother was an English teacher for 20 something years. So I was raised
Mm.
on words and books and those kinds of things. I don't have her talent, but it sounds like what you're doing is beautiful, like especially writing about borderline, or maybe you're not using the term borderline, but some of the symptoms and things like that. Like
Hmm.
we need to normalize the experience of having big feelings.
Yeah, I like the way you put that. It is funny because the novel I published years ago, I didn't use the word BPD and I hadn't been diagnosed with it then. I think I was very dimly aware of it. And then shortly after that, once I became aware of it, I was just so afraid of being diagnosed with it. But I don't even think it was really on my radar. But it is such a BPD book. You look back, you're like, okay, that's what that was. I'm wondering, so after you got diagnosed and as you were thinking about, and I guess you're still in that process of having children, have you gotten support from therapists about that choice? I know that I've heard a mixed bag of things from people. Sometimes people would say things like, oh, well, you should have children for these various reasons. But I've also had a couple people basically say, oh, well, you shouldn't have them
Mm.
because you have mental health problems, which I have all kinds of thoughts about that. I don't think as a blanket statement, I think that's inane, but I'm just wondering if you've ever heard that or whether people are more supportive now.
Yeah, I'm really lucky to have the treatment team that I have.
That's
I've
great.
had my therapist since 2019, so pre-COVID,
Mhm.
and my psychiatrist and my therapist work together. They meet quarterly to touch base about, how I'm doing and those kinds of things. Both my psychiatrist and my therapist have said if I wanted to parent, that I would make a very good parent. Uh,
Hmm.
they have both said if I want to parent, there is a lot of work that I have to do, in
Hmm.
order to be an effective parent. So I'm lucky that I know that I have the support of them, but I also, I take medications that I can't have a pregnancy on. Part of pregnancy then becomes kind of like a signing off of, okay, yes, you can try to get pregnant because you're ready to adjust these meds. You're ready to go on a lower dose of lithium, get off of Vraylar, get onto Adderall and off of Vyvanse. And obviously, we've had the conversation because I know some of those medications that would need to
Yeah,
change, but that is a barrier that I have to be stable enough for my team to be willing to make those changes with my medication.
right.
I have too much of a will to keep living to just go off of my medication on my own and get pregnant. Like, if I went off of all my medications cold turkey, I'm pretty confident that I wouldn't survive that.
Yeah.
So I have strong supports. I know that if and when I'm ready, my team will do that with me. But I also know that like I do have to have the support of my team to do that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
There's another barrier and this is really the hardest part because if I could parent, if I could get pregnant in an easier way, I think that I would parent. I think that I would mother. I think that I'm capable of mothering and creating an environment that would foster resilience and independence and creativity and all of these things for a child. I think that I could do that. But there's this other barrier that is like, I'm married to a trans man. There's not sperm floating around in my life, so there's this,
Right.
I have to be 100% confident that my mental health is stable enough. I need to have my team sign off on it. And then I have to find and pay for sperm. And it needs to be like, so I need to be pretty confident that I'm ready to do this in order to
Right.
like go find that
Yeah.
missing piece. And that missing piece is very expensive. So it's a whole multi-step thing. And as I continue thinking about it, I'm turning 32, like
Hmm.
there's that age piece as well that it feels like it's sort of getting further and further out of reach.
It's a lot of pressure on you. It sounds like just because, like you said, there's all these things that have to happen almost at the same time. I just imagine that that is a lot of pressure.
Well, and also we can't ignore a Trump presidency, like,
Yeah, although I suppose the one of the very few silver linings, isn't there some talk that they're going to fund IVF at least, or they're gonna try supposedly try to increase payments for people who have to get pregnant through other methods. Um,
yeah, I'm not confident that that will apply to queer people.
yeah,
I
I'm not
don't
really
I don't think
confident
that
either.
I'm included in that. But
Yeah,
I did hear that at
good
the beginning
point.
of his presidency. Yeah.
Yeah, I would not be at all surprised if there was some interview process and you have to be, yeah, straight, white,
Rich.
Christian, rich, yeah.
Yeah.
Like not so rich that you couldn't afford it on your own, but you're doing okay. Like,
Yeah.
oh, I know. It's such a nightmare. It does seem like your podcast is very motherly in the best sense. Like
Mm.
it's not bossy or kind of imposing in any way, not in that sense, but it's very nurturing. It seems like you have a gift for kind of understanding what's in the air and what people might be concerned about. Like I remember noticing on election day when, one of your episodes popped up and it said, an election anxiety. And I was like, yeah, that's exactly what I'm feeling. And anticipating the needs of people is such an important maternal quality. So I can definitely understand why your treatment team says, yeah, I think you'd be a beautiful mother. You have those qualities. Yeah, the medication piece is tough. I thought about that too with lupus. There are certain things. I would say I'm 51 and I have a lot of friends who got pregnant late, like late 30s, early 40s, and I can't think of anyone who didn't say that they were happy with their decision. Like they actually felt good about waiting. They were at good places in their lives, their marriages, their careers. There is such a pressure on people who want to have children and that biological clock. It's also kind of a cultural clock as well.
Yeah.
I knew one friend who said she was so glad that she didn't have gray hair when she had a child like in her early 40s because someone she knew did, and like a stranger I think who saw that they were pregnant and started telling her like, oh, you're too old to have children. I mean, people are just awful and ignorant, and so I think that kind of seeps into us too. So even if we're still okay, our bodies can still handle it, we just have this immense pressure. Do you feel like you're getting more support with this decision-making process, though? I heard in one of your episodes you were talking with a woman who um, had resources for people who wanted to become pregnant. There were some resources for queer families, even just some amazing things that, would have been hard to come by, 10, 15 years ago or so. Have you been finding more things like that?
Yeah, I think I feel like I'm missing a community for parenting, but resource-wise, like I do feel pretty confident in my ability to develop like cope ahead plans. Like the cope ahead plan from DBT is a lifesaver. And
Mhm.
so for the situations like if I were hospitalized or something like that, like if I needed an inpatient stay, this is what that would look like. We would develop this plan. And so I feel fairly confident in those ways. I think where I feel less confident is in the day to day. Like we decided to move away from family for a
Hmm.
lot of reasons, largely financial. We just couldn't afford to live in the Portland area anymore and have
Yeah,
what we wanted. But there's not like baby's gonna go to grandma's for a couple of hours like that. My life
right.
doesn't look like that. So
Yeah,
I am working at building community where I live, and I think that I'm working at building community that is borderline friendly and
hmm.
with people that I can say I have borderline personality disorder to.
Yes.
And we have one really beautiful friendship with another couple that I have been able to be like that with, and they are so rad. And so, as we
Yeah.
build more community like that, I think that I would feel more comfortable with parenting.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Having
no one
that
does it
support.
alone. I mean that's one of my things that when people say negative things about couples who are childless, it's we need both people with children and people without. I know at the university where I teach, I've gotten asked to take on things because people with children couldn't during COVID. Like I have kids at home where I can't have this 8:30 a.m. class because I have to pick up my children. Well, I can. It isn't great for me. It isn't great for attendance, but we need everyone to help out. It really does take a village. And I really like what you said, that you want a community of people to whom you can share your diagnosis. And I just want to emphasize this, that I hope people really never doubt someone as a parent or potential parent just because they have mental health problems, because there are all kinds of people with mental health problems who are great parents, and there are people without them who are really not good parents at all. And I feel like that's an important shift that needs to keep happening. Thank you for being so open about that. I also, kind of along the same lines, I wanted to close by talking about something that you said on your podcast. I think you were talking about, again, about the Trump administration and the political situation and crisis in the US. And you were talking about just trying to stay alive through all this and all the anxiety people have about things like, will they lose their health insurance? I mean, which is a real concern. Will they lose Medicaid? Will they lose access to their medications? And you said people with BPD, we are crazy resilient. Why do you think people with BPD are so resilient? And why is it so easy for us to forget that?
Oh gosh. I think it's easy to forget it because of all of the stigma that exists, right? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a 23-year-old kid still figuring out who I am, learning I have borderline, and at the same time sitting in my master's level social work program being told my least favorite client to work with is the queer borderline, the young bisexual
Right.
borderline, right? Like,
Yeah.
of course we hate ourselves when this is the dialogue that we're being
Of
told.
course.
Like,
Yeah.
you're the last person that I want anything to do with. So we forget because of those things, but our resilience is based in having to get up and do this every day, right? Like
Yeah.
every single day you get out of bed and you know, okay, today I'm going to have some really big feelings about something I don't need to have really big feelings about. And I'm going to have to navigate it and my responsibility. And I think I'm sober, right? I had to surrender to being an alcoholic. I also feel
Yeah.
like part of the resilience with borderline is like I surrender to the fact that I have these big feelings that often are overwhelming, and if I let them will control my life. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
choosing to learn how to live with them. I am choosing to learn how to still have a good life at the same time as feeling overwhelmed, feeling suicidal, hating my partner, whatever it is
Yeah.
the symptoms are that are presenting, I still choose to live a good life. Like I am still out there choosing to find joy. And when you surrender to that choice, I feel like you're nothing but resilient. You just are resilient. You just are because you show up and you have to do it every day. And that's not to say that or people without borderline aren't also resilient, but there's a deeper work that has to happen when you live this life that makes you just more capable of navigating adversity, I think.
I love the word surrender. I think that's a really helpful one. One last question, and maybe you answered it even by becoming a are you a social worker or a therapist now?
I'm a licensed clinical social
Mhm.
worker, which gives me the ability to work in therapy and do therapy. But I'm a social worker before I'm a therapist. Whereas if someone goes to graduate school to get their marriage and family therapist degree, that would be mostly all they do is therapy. As a
Right.
social worker, a lot of us work in hospitals or work in community mental health or whatever, and I just happen to work as a therapist.
I think it's amazing, amazing work. And I'm just wondering if you could say something to this colleague who were just denigrating people with BPD and especially queer people with BPD, what would you say to them if you could?
I think if I could go back, and there's a few moments that stand out. The
Mhm.
professor who said my least favorite client is the young bisexual borderline. And there was also a moment when I was working as a case manager at the state, one of my peers said that their client was a borderline from hell, which is
Mhm.
the tagline that I have stolen. It's my Instagram handle. It's like I hated that term for so long, but I also thought it was
Right.
so funny,
Right, it is.
I think what I would have said to them is
I've
you're,
had moments as a borderline from hell.
oh
I'll admit
yeah.
it,
Oh my God, absolutely. Oh, every day there's something. No, I think what I would have said is you're talking about me. I don't think I would have said anything negative. I would have just like sat in front of them and said, you're talking about me.
Right. And then they have to come to terms with that, like with the person in front of them whom they know in this three-dimensional way. That's great. I love that. Thank you so much for talking to me today. Sarah, is there anything that you want to say?
I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but thank you so much for the opportunity to hang out and chat. And I hope that if anybody who has BPD and is thinking about mothering or parenting listens to this, don't forget to have your own story and your own perspective. And please don't be impacted by, my thought process. Like your thought process around parenting and mothering is powerful. And make choices independent of what other people, might tell you. Just trust that your gut instinct is the right instinct.